Well, I want to thank you for inviting me to join you this year at your meeting. In my 5-minute video, I want to talk a little bit about where we are with control of emissions. This meeting is about adaptation, but the questions about emissions control are really important as we think about the level of adaptation that's going to be required. So in my opening remarks, my name is David Victor, and I'm a professor at UC San Diego at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and I'm also a fellow at the Brookings Institution. Today, I'd like to make two points. The first point that I'd like to make is that we're engaged in a giant global experiment, in effect, to find solutions to the climate crisis. Earlier this year, the International Energy Agency, when it reported about the state of energy technology, said that 3/4 of the technologies and systems needed for deep decarbonization haven't been invented yet. And that's the kind of work that needs to be done, is detailed work, sector by sector, understanding which technologies work, which don't work, in effect running a whole bunch of experiments. And I think one of the things we have to recognize is that not every place on the planet is running those experiments. This chart here shows where we were in 1990, the pie chart on the left, where we were in 1990 with regard to emissions in the planet. And what I've done is I've divided the world up not into the names of countries, but into their political interests. Countries that frankly don't want a lot of climate change policy, blockers, countries that are going to be reliable leaders in the effort to tackle climate change, reliable leaders, and then the rest of the world that is happy to work on climate change, but is not going to put that as a top priority. And in 1990, about 1/3 of global emissions came from these reliable leaders. 2005, which is the base year for many emission inventories, that shrinks down to close to a quarter. The blockers, interesting enough, stay the same. And then if you wind the tape of history forward to almost the present day, the reliable leaders are now about 1/5 of global emissions and shrinking. And that's the deep irony in the climate change problem, is that the more the innovators, the leaders do to address the problem, the less relevant they become to the climate change problem. Why do we care about this? We care about this because the whole strategy around deep decarbonization has to be one where the innovators go innovate, but then they have to pay much closer attention to how those innovations get translated into the rest of the world. And that's a slow process, as we know from studying the history of technological change. And that means we're probably in for a whole lot of adaptation. Had we started back in 1990, when 1/3 of global emissions, maybe more depending on how you count, came from countries that wanted to do something about the climate change problem, we'd be in a different situation today, but we didn't. And so we're now committed, frankly, to a whole lot of warming. And I think more than most people think when you look at the politics and the processes by which industrial systems change. The other thing I want to say is about the role of stimulus. A lot of attention these days to economic stimulus. It's not the first time we've seen an economic recession. This one's bigger, thanks to the pandemic and the global shutdown. But if you look at this chart here, which shows over time since the beginning of the modern energy age in the early 1970s, fossil fuel emissions of CO2 in the vertical axis, horizontal axis is time, and what you see are emissions go up as the economies grow, then you have a recession, emissions drop a little bit, then they resume. And you have this rising and dropping and resuming pattern that has the lines have different slopes. And so after the Asian financial crisis, we saw a very steep recovery because of the tremendous, frankly, recarbonization of the Asian economies. In the last decade or so, we've actually seen a slower growth. And if you put those together and make projections out into the future from the drop in emissions that we've seen right now as a result of the pandemic, what you see is a big drop in emissions this year because of the pandemic. All the signs are that that's starting to recover now. And then it could recover on a steep line or it could recover on a shallow line. But it's the slope of the line for the recovery that really matters. The 1-year drop, because the CO2 is a stock pollutant in the atmosphere, the 1-year drop in emissions, frankly, doesn't matter anywhere near as much, maybe by a factor of 2 or 3, as we argue in this paper. This chart comes from a paper in Nature earlier in June of this year. It's the 1-year drop that doesn't matter nearly as much as the slope of the line in the recovery. That matters because, in effect, the stimulus packages should be seen as packages that are trying to redesign the global economy. That could happen with a lot of spending. So far, I am not seeing a lot of evidence that that spending is happening on clean energy outside of Europe. That might happen in the United States, maybe a few other places, but that's the nature of the challenge I think that we face right now, which is that there's growing concern about climate change, not yet growing doing about climate change. And that means the adaptation agenda, frankly, is going to be a bigger and more central part of the climate change policy discussion in the years ahead. Thank you very much.